Are heaven and hell concepts that come from our imagination? Let's find out what the greatest spiritual story ever told has to say about the nature of heaven and hell. As we go deeper on the spiritual path, we continually reveal the absurdity of a lot of concepts that we've held on to all of our lives. And a lot of these concepts are the ones that shape our way of thinking, shape our mentality, and in some sense shape our morality as well. And so two of the main concepts that a lot of people hold on to are these concepts of heaven and hell. Now, within the Nididhyasana texts, now Nididhyasana texts are a group of texts for those on the cusp of enlightenment or those who have gone beyond the pale of enlightenment, we find that the deeper we go on the path and after enlightenment, all of these things are conceptual and related to our imagination. Now, in no book is that revealed more so than in the Ashtavakra Gita. So I want to read to you a very important verse about concepts, imagination, heaven and hell, and also freedom and bondage that will give you a greater understanding and a deeper perspective of the ideas and concepts that shape our life that don't really exist but are built on our imagination. Body, heaven and hell, bondage and freedom, as also fear, all these are mere imagination. What have I to do with all these? I, whose nature is pure consciousness. This is a very enlightening verse. Now, I love how Ashtavakra even explains that fear itself is imagination because fear is built on a lot of these dualistic ideas of heaven and hell, bondage and freedom, etc. And so to explain that idea of fear, we need to explain the conceptual framework of these dualistic concepts, right? And so Ashtavakra is saying that these are all mere imagination because when we look at it, right, heaven and hell is built somewhat as a moral system, right? You do good in life, you go to somewhere good. You do bad in life, you go to hell for eternity, and so forth and so on. Obviously, in Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism, the Abrahamic concept of heaven and hell doesn't really exist. But you have these kind of heavenly realms and hellish realms where one can reincarnate in, and hopefully their soul can rise out of those hellish realms back into a heavenly realm or back into a human form so that it can hopefully go into a heavenly realm, etc. But it's not exactly the same as the Abrahamic idea of heaven and hell, where you go to hell for eternity, or if you're a believer, then you go to heaven for eternity. It's just a choice. You just make a choice and it's like a computer game. You make a choice and it happens and then that's it. You finish the game. I know it doesn't sound logical from the higher knowledge. And that also relates to Sanatana Dharma in that sense too, because there are certain schools within Sanatana Dharma that, as I said, you go into a hellish realm or a heavenly realm, and it's all built on the idea of duality. And so when you come to the non-dualist traditions, particularly Advaita Vedanta, Vajrayana Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and Taoism and these type of non-dualist schools, this idea of good and bad, right and wrong are all thrown out because good according to who? Bad according to who? Whose moral system is right and whose moral system is wrong? You'll see all these religions will all argue with each other over whose moral system is right or wrong. And they're both wrong because they're both basing it on a dualistic perspective. And so heaven and hell from this perspective are conceptual because we're basing it on right or wrong, good and evil according to our own conditioning and our own subjective viewpoint. And so then we either judge ourselves with that moral system or we judge others, right? Oh, so they go into hell and they go into heaven and so forth and so on. But these are concepts that come into the mind. As Ashtavakra said, this is pure imagination. It's not the fundamental reality that we can all come back into harmony with. It's not that undifferentiated consciousness of Atman, which you are, which is identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality, right? And so Atman and Brahman, in that sense, aren't conceptual because they're not under the frame of duality. Even though you could say, okay, Atman is a different concept in some sense to Brahman, but the idea is they're the same thing, right? We're just using language in that sense to explain that all is Brahman. And so how do we explain that in an individual? Well, the individual has the Atman in them, and that Atman is identical with Brahman. And so we're all that. And so all is Brahman. And so the idea that there could be a heaven or hell doesn't exist, because the nature of the Atman and the Brahman, as Ashtavakra said, is pure consciousness. So from pure consciousness, how could these concepts exist? They don't exist. It doesn't matter to pure consciousness, because pure consciousness is pure, undifferentiated, non-dual consciousness. That's what it is. It doesn't live in the field of duality. So as long as we continue to think that the body, bondage and freedom, heaven and hell are real, then we are impelled to act in relation to them. And this is where fear comes in as part of imagination, right? As Ashtavakra explained, because fear is the byproduct of a conceptual framework that is based on imagination. So we live in fear when we think of these ideas of bondage and freedom, of our own bodily existence, and also heaven and hell, and many other dualistic concepts as well. But Ashtavakra is highlighting three of the main dualistic ideas that we all get caught in: the body and living in this world, and also bondage and freedom, and lastly, heaven and hell. So he uses those three to explain this. And so most of us live in fear according to the idea of duality. The fear arises because of duality. Fear can't exist if you know that your Atman is Brahman, if you know that Brahman alone is real, there's only Brahman. How could fear exist? Because that is the ultimate reality. We are that. And that's the great boon. That's the great joy and bliss that we understand from following the great traditions. There is no separation from anything. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't protect yourself and you shouldn't protect your jiva, your ego persona system. Obviously, naturally, you will do that. But something has changed within. You finally understand that you are that. And so you are not a hostage to these dualistic concepts that have come from the imagination of minds a long, long time ago, right? And they came from people who lived in duality, who didn't go to the spiritual depths of the non-dual Brahman. And so a lot of people are hostage to these ideas of good and bad, right and wrong. And in Taoism, Zhuangzi even explains this beautifully, because he uses the Maoist idea of Qing, which means species-specific essence. And he says that our species-specific essence is a flaw, because our species-specific essence is the ability to dissect the world up into this and that. And then we build this dualistic framework for ourselves, which is built in our own conditioning, in our own likes and our dislikes, which fragments the oneness of reality into millions of pieces. Hence, in Taoism, they say the 10,000 things, right? We all come from Wu Qi, Tao and stillness, and from Wu Qi comes Tai Chi, Tao in motion, which comes yin and yang, and then the 10,000 things. And we think the 10,000 things, this fragmentation of the oneness, is who we are. But we are the Wu Qi. We are Brahman fundamentally, and no dualistic concept could define who we are. But the problem is, when we buy into these dualistic concepts, we believe we are either a sinner or someone who is good or beyond sin. And so this is very detrimental to our own spiritual growth, because if we understand that we're all Brahman, our conduct and ethics would be naturally good, because we are fundamentally naturally good. But we learn these bad ideas from a world that says we are beasts from birth. And then there are believers and non-believers, someone who sins and someone who doesn't sin. This is all a terrible idea, and an illusionary idea that comes from imagination. The ultimate reality is the fundamental reality. It's all that exists. And so if we all understood that, then the concept of heaven and hell, bondage and liberation, and the body itself would all disappear, because the only reality is the Atman within you and me, which is identical with Brahman. Shanti, shanti, shanti.